with an intro to the Basque language for those that don't know much about it, looking at where it is, what it consists of, before moving on and looking more at the sociolinguistics of the Basque country. So first of all, the Basque country is actually very close to us here in the UK. It is the very southwestern corner of France, which has the French Basque country, and then the much larger Spanish Basque country, of which you have the cities like Bilbao, San Sebastian, Pamplona, and the famous Kingdom of Navarre. The Basque language itself is a non-Indo-European language. So that means that linguistically, structurally, in terms of syntax and grammar, it is very far away from languages such as French and Spanish which surround it. So this is basically because Basque as a language and as a community of people existed prior to the Indo-European tribes, which came to Europe several thousands of years ago. And another peculiarity of the Basque language is the fact that it has no known relatives. So here you've got a map of language families in Europe. So the majority is the green of Indo-European languages, which has the subfamily of Romance, Slavic languages. Indo-European languages themselves go all the way to the Indian Peninsula, so even Hindustani languages are actually quite similar. And that's an interesting fact, I think, that Spanish and Hindustani languages have more in common grammatically than Basque and Spanish. And Basque itself has no other relatives. So one example of the interestingness of the Basque language itself is in word order. And this is a big problem for me learning the Basque language, because I'd learned first French and then Spanish, and you can tend to see, for those that have maybe learned French then Spanish, that the order is, although some words change, the overall order is very similar. So this is just a random sentence I thought of. He told me about you. So in Spanish, él me habló de ti, and in French, il m'a parlé de toi. In Basque, on the other hand, literally it would be about you, speak he to me. So effectively, Yoda speak maybe for English people. And this is obviously a challenge for learners, but for Basques themselves, this is very much, being their mother tongue, it's very normal for them. Funnily enough, Basque people that speak better Basque than Spanish often really mix it up. And Spanish people always know if they're speaking to a Basque person because they might put the verb right at the end of the sentence. In terms of lexicon, there are several groups of Basque words. So first of all, you have what you'd call the most Basque words, which have existed in the Basque language for thousands of years. So for example, fire, you can see fire in French and Spanish in these languages which also exist in the Basque country. They both have the same root, so feu, fuego, whereas Basque it's Soule. So that's just one example. There are hundreds, thousands of examples. On the other hand, due to contact with other Latin languages over the last millennia, Basque has absorbed a lot of loan words, particularly old Latin words which came through the church in the Middle Ages. So for example, the word for body in Basque is gorputz, and you may not see it. Personally, I didn't realise until having used the word, I don't know, 500 times. But gorputz actually comes from corpus in Latin, which you can see as well in cuerpo in Spanish and in corps in French. So there are many words that have come into the language over the centuries which is sort of Basquified, almost to an extent where you can't really see that they're actually Latin. And finally, you have a lot of loan words which are coming into the Basque language more and more due to contact with French and Spanish. So those that know French or Spanish will see these are very high frequency informal words which are used a lot in spoken Basque. So, as already mentioned, the Basque country and the Basque language has had a lot of contact with other languages over the centuries. But it wasn't until the 20th century that this relationship became very damaging for the Basque language itself. And this was due to, really on both sides of the Basque country, so both in France and in Spain, it came under a lot of pressure. So here you've got Franco, the dictator in Spain, who reigned for 40 years and who was strongly against all minority languages. And this meant that Basque was completely banned from schools. It was even banned from being spoken in the streets, for example. And this meant that the language had to go underground into houses, some illegal schools which were around the Spanish Basque country, but it really decreased in its extent. On the other hand, in France, I wouldn't say that there was any one leader which caused this suppression of the Basque language, rather a long policy of the Republic which has been to encourage one form of French, damaging all other dialects. So here you've got a map of the linguistic diversity of France, with Basque right in that southwest corner, and this has really had a slow effect, negative effect on the Basque language. And you hear there are lots of really disturbing anecdotes and stories from this time. Just the other day, I was just scrolling through some of the oral records of older Basque people, and this French Basque man mentions how when he was at school, when he was maybe 10 years old, and he didn't know much French because this was a very Basque-speaking region, whenever he spoke Basque in class, and this was, the 40s, 50s, not only would he get beaten, but his teacher thought up of a more psychological way to get at this child, which was to write on a whiteboard, Je suis Basque, je suis bête, so I am Basque, I am stupid. He put the board on this child's back and made the child walk around the classroom, around the corridor, and even around the town. So all of the, these adult workers could see to what extent the Basque language was stigmatized.
Not an enlightened form of teaching then?
Well, and I think the most surprising thing is this teacher was a Basque speaker, and he was Basque himself. So you can see how the French, this sort of psyche, this idea of hierarchy of languages, really made itself into the Basque psyche, into their identity themselves. They saw their language as a second level language. So with the death of Franco, Basque suddenly had more freedom, at least in the Spanish Basque country, which I must say contains most Basques. So this has historically been the centre of sort of Basque identity to an extent. But there was one big problem, which was the problem of dialects. Because Basque has never really had one state which has unified the language. In many other areas, you can see in France with Paris, Spain with Castile, English, London to an extent. So Basque didn't have this. And you can also see that it was, so this is just a language, this is just a map of the extent of Basque usage. So you can see really in the southern half of the Basque country, it hasn't really been used for the last few hundred years, but nonetheless, in the northern coastal parts, so you've got the provinces of Bizkaia, Gipuzkoa, Navarre, and the French Basque country, it's still used to a large extent. But as I say, the problem of dialects, and these aren't just sort of slightly different accents or a couple of different words. I personally would see them, as we've seen in the previous talk, this idea of language and dialect. Personally, I think the differences are great enough for them to be different languages. So these are the examples of two dialects, which I'm actually going to talk about in a minute. So I thought about another sentence. In English it would be, the sun has come out, thank goodness, now we can go to the mountain with our parents. And in the Biscayan dialect, which is in the far western end of the Spanish Basque country, they would say, Eguzkia kurtendao, eskerrak, oin gure suekas mendire joan genke. Whereas on the other hand, in the eastern French Basque country, they would say, Ekia elkiduk, beare, orai aita tamekilan bortiala joitilan butuk. So you can see pretty much every word is different. In terms of order, you can very much see that it's Basque, but one person that spoke one dialect and another speaking the other, with no help of a standard, they would have to go to Spanish or French because there were more similarities. Other problems were just, the sheer amount of different words. So this is weekend, such a banal word as that. So in English, you've got one form, whereas in Basque, dozens and dozens of forms. On the other hand, there was the problem of the French and Spanish influence. So in terms of mutual intelligibility, although French and Spanish are similar words, they also have a lot, different, they've got a big amount of words that are very distinct. So here, for example, you've got rabbit, which as a word into the French Basque country, in the French Basque, they use the word lapin, whereas in Spanish Basque, they use the word conejo. And you multiply this by thousands, or maybe not thousands, hundreds of different high frequency words, and this makes mutual intelligibility across the border much more difficult. So something had to be done, and thankfully for the Basque language community, something was done. So in 1968, the Basque Language Academy decided to create a unified Basque, so a standard form. Some call this an artificial language, and I'd say to an extent it is, because in effect they took different characteristics from different dialects, put them together, and made this standard language for formal communication, for schooling in the Spanish Basque country, in which Basque was to become official and the language of schools, and also for media, because in the end you need you need a spelling which is uniform for a language to be respectable in media or in television. So they had to make a lot of decisions, and one of the big decisions was obviously what word to choose. So here you've got just a quick example of the month of June, and you see pretty much every province had a completely different word for this. And in the end, they had to make a lot of different decisions. Although it must be said that on the whole, they prioritized the central region, where you've got that garragil, that word, because over the history, in what small Basque literature there was, that had been the dialect of prestige. So, with this in mind, I personally learned this unified Basque form first. That's what most students do. But I was very curious as to what the dialects consisted of, because even when I passed my C1 exam, I did not understand hardly a word of the dialect. So having listened to them a lot, for example, going to lectures in first term, every term listening to the provincial radio stations, I thought it would be really interesting to look at the most different dialects. Not the dialects themselves, but rather the sociolinguistic situation. Because as you can imagine, in these societies, these dialects are very much still alive, very much still used, but they also have the influence of unified Basque, which has now spent 40, 50 years in education, and finally the state language, French and Spanish. Because all of these people, although they're Basque speakers, they're all fluent in either French or Spanish, depending on the country. So personally, I would call these triglossias. Even though a Basque person would never tell you that the dialects are a different language to unified Basque, I would say that the difference is such that we can call it a triglossia. So this is Zuberoa. This is the Eastern case study we're going to look at, which is in France. It is influenced a lot by the language, the Occitan language. So not actually French, funny enough, because French only really arrived here about 100, 150 years ago. And Arratia, which is the far west near Bilbao. This is also fairly rural, and both have a similar amount of Basque speakers. About 60-70% speak Basque fluently, and about 50% of all conversations are in Basque. Nonetheless, you can see there are differences in the amount Basque is used. As a rule, the further away you are from big Spanish or French-speaking metropolises, the more Basque is going to be spoken. So you can see here in the left map, this is the Spanish case study. Arratia is actually right between Bilbao and Vitoria-Gasteiz, which are the two biggest cities in the Basque country. Very little Basque spoken, but nonetheless you see up to 65% of conversations can be in Basque in some areas. Zuberoa is a much bigger area, but it's much more sparsely populated. Nonetheless, you can see Basque is spoken in all areas. So overall, I'd like to give some similarities between these two regions, because you can imagine they're very far away from each other. In different countries, different levels of officiality. In France, Basque is still not official. In Spain, it is the language of school. Nonetheless, there were quite a few similarities in language use in both of these communities. So first of all, linguistically, there were some aspects which you could call archaic, which have survived in these distant dialects. And that includes obviously some words which maybe are not used in the central dialect. But the thing I'd like to really underline is the Itano, which is a special case. As mentioned in the intro, it's called the allocative case in linguistics. And I think it's amazing because basically it's effectively an informal way of speaking. Like maybe in French you have vous voyez, tout voyez, depending on the dynamics of your conversation. But the difference with this is that it specifies whether the person you're speaking to is male or female or of higher status. So effectively, if I were to speak to a woman in using this case, which is still very much used in these dialects, every single verb I conjugate will be conjugated to take into account her gender. The same with a man and the same with someone of a higher social standing. And this really creates a feeling of intimacy, because every single thing you're saying, you're taking into account that person's identity. And I've never experienced that in any other language or in Unified Basque. Really quite special, I think. In terms of generational differences, obviously being a dynamic linguistic community, things do change. On the whole, I would say that older people tend to have a better level of Basque than younger people. And they would also have a better level of Basque than, they would not even speak any Unified Basque because they would not be in school in Basque. So they're actually illiterate in Basque, even though it's their language of day to day. They probably read in Spanish or French, they probably watch TV in Spanish or French, but their language of communication tends to be Basque. Then there are some big differences among young people from the Spanish and French case study because of the role of Basque in education. But we'll look at that in differences in a minute. Another big similarity is the battle against French and Spanish. So this is a constant battle. When I was interviewing people in the Basque country when I was there, it was a constant message I got that, even if they make this effort to speak Basque to their kids, even if their child goes to a Basque language school, they still often come home speaking French or Spanish because maybe their classmates are not Basque speakers. And it's a constant battle to keep this going. And this really in contrast to maybe 40 or 50 years ago, when French and Spanish did not have the power they do today in these societies. And finally, the idea of complexes. So, and I think this is something which, with the coming of this unified standard form of Basque, it is started to play in people's linguistic identity. That is to say, in both areas, I heard stories about people looking up to this unified Basque and looking down on their own dialect. So, for example, now each week I talk online on Skype to people from an old folks' home in Basque, in the dialect, in the Western dialect, and constantly I say, oh, your Basque is fantastic, your Basque is fantastic. And they say, no, it's terrible, it's half Spanish, this Valley's Basque is so much better. However much I try, they're not having it. It's really deeply embedded, and it's often linked to linguistic purity. Because one thing the Unified Basking has done is they often take maybe words which have come from Spanish or French and try and find this Basque form, which is purer or has got more heritage in the language. And then on the other hand, in the Zuberoa, in the French case study, apparently I was talking to the local radio, and they said that they often try and interview older people just for the radio. And normally those older people say, no, my Basque isn't good enough. So these are people that speak better Basque than French, but they say their Basque is not good enough because they hear the radio or they hear this unified Basque, which is pure or whatever, and so I think this is quite a big issue. And this is definitely as a result of the unified Basque. In terms of differences, as mentioned, young people's Basque proficiency varies greatly from Arratia in Spain to Zuberoa in France. Because basically in France, Basque is not official. They learn in French. The only way they're really going to learn Basque is through their families or through the few private Basque schools which are there, which interestingly are partly funded from Spain, from the Spanish Basque country. They sort of try and help the French Basque, this idea of solidarity. So that means, unfortunately, that only 1 in 5 French Zuberoan Basques actually speak the language. Whereas in Arratia, pretty much all of them do. They speak unified Basque, which they've learnt in school, and then the dialect with their friends or with their family. So this is a huge difference, and it's obviously of great consequence for the future of the language and the dialect. One thing that Zuberoa, so that French case study, does have is a fantastic heritage of theatre. So in winter, every year, they have masquerades, and in summer, they have pastorales, which are famous across France. There's a cultural, a real cultural event which is recognised across the country. And this is all in their dialect. So I think this is a real celebration of their dialect. And finally, I'll just move on to respect. So the idea of Basque as a language of respect. And I think this is a really noticeable difference from Zuberoa in France to Arratia in Spain. to the extent that, I'll explain. So basically, in France, when I was trying to organise my trip, and when I was there walking in the streets, I'd often try and speak Basque as a first word. You know, this is a Basque-speaking region. I want to practice my Basque. And often, if they were Basque speakers, they would reply very happily, you know, see a foreign person that's learned their language. But if they were not Basque speakers, the reply I got was often very negative, often sort of an affront, like how dare I speak in Basque and not in French to them. And this was reflected by the Basque speakers themselves I spoke to afterwards, and they confirmed, you never speak in Basque as a first word to people. It's just seen as a lack of respect. On the other hand, in Spain, in Arratia, speaking Basque as a first word, if that person didn't understand Basque or didn't know Basque, the reaction would always be one of apology. You know, I'm sorry, I don't speak any Basque, could we speak Spanish, please? And I think this is a result of the sort of diverging policies, language policies, in the North and South Basque country. So to conclude, I would say that in both of these communities, each of the three vernaculars have a role in society. But nonetheless, with globalization and increasing communications, as we see around the world, minority languages are a threat. They are under threat, not only minority dialects like Zuberoan and Arratian, but also the Basque language itself, you know. So I'd like to finish with a quote, which I think really defines the future of the Basque language in the Basque country. So, hizkuntza bat ez da altzen, ez dakitenek ikasten ez dutelako, dakitenek erabiltzen ez dutelako baizik. So a language does not disappear because those who do not know it do not learn it, but because those who do know it do not use it.